me? Yes, I can hear you just fine. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I would like to say thank you to both Fermania and for Julio for having come up with this initiative, as well as all the people who've been working really hard in setting up this opportunity for dialogue, which is really so significant. I would like to extend my greetings to all of our colleagues, ambassadors, representatives who are here with us, and thanks to the people who have agreed to talk to us today as well. Well, of course, we had this little technical problem at the beginning, and this actually is a good example of the way in which COVID is putting obstacles to our attempt to communicate and exchange in ideas. And bit by bit, we're trying to deal with these different problems. I'm very happy. I am Mexican and a person is who fights for the interest as well of Latin America, but I'm also very interested in finding out more about how Latin America has been dealing with this pandemic and what decisions it's been taken to try to move forwards with this crisis, which is a health crisis, but which of course has had an economic and social impact as well without precedent. We don't actually even know what the future is going to bring. We're in a second wave in Latin America, excuse me, in Europe, and Latin America is in their first wave sometimes with very high levels in terms of how it's impacting health and of course economy. And there's the most vulnerable groups, which are the ones which are suffering even more than others. So the question that I would like to throw out to this round table, and which is something that concerns all of us, all countries, all international organizations, is why were we so vulnerable when it came to facing this pandemic? Of course, nobody can know that a virus is going to appear or not. This has been part of humanity's history. The question, though, is how can it be that even the most advanced countries, their national healthcare systems, were not able to deal with or mitigate the social and economic impact that it had? And of course, all countries made a huge amount of effort, in Latin America as well, to try to um, deal with the gaps that exist in terms of social protection systems. And all of this has forced us to have to rethink about the social contract, to rethink about basic income as well, about what type of protection we can offer our citizens, not only around issues related to health, but also on the labor market, what tools for social intervention are at our disposal. It's been a dramatic time. There's been a lot of lives lost, and there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. In fact, yesterday, everything that had been done about the vaccine that was being developed in Oxford University had to be brought to a stop. So there's really so much uncertainty. We are very much still well within the worst period of the pandemic. And yet, I think there are some things that Latin America has done very well, and we want to learn and study about them. There's been some things that have been done very well because certain innovative policies have been adopted, which are based on the famous conditional transfer of resources and using databases that you've all been developing over the course of so many years, with some very specific indicators about how we can support certain groups, certain regions, how to mitigate or palliate the problems associated with the high level of the informal working conditions and the large lack of equality that exists as well in our regions. So when we try to study impact, we need to look at evidence to see how the impact of the pandemic has not been symmetrical, not been balanced in many ways, but we need to understand what policies there have been or are being implemented right now, which have been able to successfully support our people and our regions, and to help us move forward in finding a solution to all of these different challenges that this pandemic is giving us. Uh, it's going to be very difficult because, of course, we're going to have to try to figure out which are the most vulnerable communities, what children are suffering most, how has this affected violence against women, how are we going to deal with all those issues? And so, quite clearly, none of that is easy. The impact on the cultural industry, on young people, on different ethnic groups. There's the question of racism and xenophobia, manipulation of information on social networks, ethnic problems, how technology is involved in all of this, and UNESCO is very much present in all of these questions, issues that we need to be analyzing. This meeting was something that has been developed in such a way where the public can actually participate via chat. So please think about the questions you might have for us. We've got a range of quite impressive people who are going to be talking to us. And I'd like to begin by giving the floor right away via video to our Director General, our beloved Director General, Ms. Azoulay. I'd like to thank as well the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean that are here with us, the delegate and permanent ambassador of Cuba, Maria Esquivel Moinelo, who's with us. Let's listen to our Director General, who is going to be offering us some thoughts about these issues and their relation to Latin America.
Buenos días y bienvenidos a todas y todos a esta reunión.
Welcome to everyone to this meeting. Good day to you. The COVID-19 crisis is affecting the very essence of our society and is worsening a whole series of gaps that already exist, be they in relation to social, educational, cultural, or digital aspects. Now, of course, this new coronavirus did not create these gaps, but rather it has made them even more visible. It's like a mirror that reflects those injustices that exist already in our societies. Right now, while the virus is moving around actively, the greatest challenge is in how to overcome these existing divisions so that we do not lose that which has already been achieved over decades of public policy. This is an important issue, and UNESCO was therefore very interested in organizing this specific seminar. Firstly, we have been able to see inequality that exists around sickness due to a lack of Social Security coverage and lack of access to the appropriate information, especially amongst indigenous populations. The most vulnerable people have been the most affected by the virus. But what this crisis has shown us is not only that there is inequality when dealing with the illness itself, but also inequality in dealing with the consequences of the illness that impact the very cohesion of our societies. Around economic and social issues, it is estimated that the difference in wealth that exists already and which are already quite significant will be even worse. First of all, amongst indigenous communities whose poverty level is six times greater than the average in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's estimated that 45 million more people will be added to the 230 million that already exist who are poor. Before lockdown, girls and women were those who already were at a greater risk. Because, first of all, we've got gender inequality, but there is also social inequality. We've seen that there's been an increase in domestic violence, as shown by the number of calls that are made to helplines in countries such as Chile and Mexico, where they've increased as much as by 50%. We have to understand all of these different phenomena that the virus has exposed so clearly. And we have to do this if we want to fight them effectively. That's why for various our organizations has been mobilizing the MOST program in the region in order to study and overcome these inequalities. For example, by offering online courses, specific online courses, the most popular of which has gathered some 11,000 participants from 135 different countries. Then it's important as well to eliminate this inequality. And that work, which obviously takes time, begins via education. And in this sphere of education, we have also seen, thanks to COVID, that there are profound inequalities. Education is a fundamental issue for Latin America and the Caribbean, where some 63% of the population is under 30 years of age. And yet, at this moment in time, some 82% of students in the region are not going to school, according to the data that we have available to us right now. In such circumstances, the majority of governments have come up with quick, long distance education solutions to try to maintain a certain type of teaching and learning continuity with the limits that that entails. Nevertheless, that was and is a huge task, and it required the mobilization of international solidarity. Therefore, in mid March, UNESCO started up with a new coalition, which is the Global Education Coalition for COVID-19, to try to promote the continuity of teaching and learning in a very specific way, trying to take advantage of all available solutions, since more than a third of students of the region do not have access to a computer at their home. To give you an example, in Argentina, we're working with our new partner, Telefonica, and we've been able to offer data packages for free in order to facilitate access to the Ministry of Education's educational content. We've also offered training modules, online training modules for teachers. And in El Salvador with Huawei, we've also been able to offer tablets. We need to study other ways, or we've had to come up with other ways as well, such as using television or radio. But obviously, since a computer or a tablet or a smartphone can never be a substitute for a teacher, we have to work to make sure that we can open schools again and think about future education. UNESCO is collaborating quite closely with its member states towards this goal. And for example, we have drafted and working together with UNICEF, as well as the World Food Program and the World Bank, we've come up with a specific guide to offer them support at this very delicate moment of reopening. This guide is now available in 7 different languages, amongst which we find both Spanish and Portuguese. This educational crisis is serious and deep going, but we must learn from it. That's what our International Committee on the Future of Education is doing, to try to develop more inclusive and resilient educational systems.
Education, science is another common good we need to invest in, today maybe more than ever. According to our next science report, to be published at the beginning of next year, research and development only accounts for 1.72% of global GDP. This percentage, which should be around 3% normally, is just 0.82% in the region, and even lower in some countries. Here, once again, our role is to mobilize the international community, creating a positive dynamic through network effects. It is not just a question of investing more, but it is also, and we've seen it during the crisis, a question of sharing data, sharing protocols, sharing the results of research. As our fight against COVID has shown, open access to scientific information is essential. It is this information that has allowed the scientific community to advance, maybe like never before. And this is why UNESCO, with the support from its member states, is currently developing a recommendation on open science to be adopted for 2021. This is also why in April we maintained the Latin America and the Caribbean Open Science Forum, better known as the ECLAC Forum, bringing together researchers from the natural and social sciences field. This event aimed to strengthen ties between the scientific community and regional institutions. And last point, the impact of the crisis on heritage and culture. As the virus spread, the transmission of tangible and intangible cultural heritage came to an abrupt halt. At the peak of the crisis, almost all of the region's museums had closed, along with 89% of its World Heritage sites. Regional festivals celebrating living traditions were also cancelled. At a time when many institutions are struggling to survive, we must support those who work to support this transmission. I would therefore take this opportunity to pay tribute to a great man, Professor Eusebio Leal Spengler, the historian, el historiador de La Habana, whom I met for the last time in December in Cuba. We owe him a lot. He worked tirelessly to document and transmit the history of the capital city, the center of which is one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites. Taking a stand for heritage also means ensuring that it feeds our imagination, that it feeds today's creativity at a time when the cultural sector is facing serious difficulties. This was why UNESCO's aim was to launch the Resiliart debate, which we did, to bring together different actors from the cultural and heritage fields to find ways out of the crisis. 1/4 of all these debates have taken place in the region, covering culture in all its diversity. A wide range of topics have been addressed: the situation of community theaters in Latin America, urban dance, the resilience of Afro-descendant artists, or the role of the creative economy in driving economic recovery. The interest that this movement has generated shows the importance of regression, especially for such a culturally rich and diverse region. This mobilization is of utmost importance, almost existential. And I think here we can recall the words of the former Secretary General of the United Nations, the Peruvian Javier de Cuellar, who said that it is culture that constitutes the source and ultimate goal of development, that establishes it on sound basis, that gives it enduring foundations in history, and finally informs the promises of the future. I would therefore like to thank you for addressing all these issues today, which concerns the very future of our society. Thank you for your attention.
Over to you, Julio.
Pardon. Ahora tiene la palabra la señora Yaime Esquivel, presidenta del Grupo Latinoamericano.
Moinelo, the chair of CULAC at UNESCO and the permanent ambassador and permanent delegate of Cuba to UNESCO. You have the floor, madam.
Aló, Yaima.
Hello, Yaima, can you hear us?
Señora Yaima Esquivel.
Madam, Yaima Esquivel Moinelo, can you hear us?
Aló. Parecería que hay algún problema técnico de conexión. Yaima está en su oficina en París.
It seems that we have some technical problem. There's Yaima. She's online. Good afternoon, everybody. We had some problems connecting ourselves to this conversation. Madam Director General, Madam ADG, distinguished panelists, ambassadors, other colleagues who've joined us this afternoon. We are going through a very complex moment in human history, this global crisis that has been thrust upon us by COVID-19. This has placed great challenges in the path of leaders around the world. And Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the regions that's been most deeply impacted by this. And there is a real threat of a systemic crisis that would hinder all of the work we've made in making progress towards development. Now, one of the things that we can anticipate in the short term is an increase in poverty, inequalities, and social exclusion. Now, we think it's very important for us, for all the governments in the area, to implement policies that are inclusive and that are based on solidarity to leave no one behind. We have to be looking at the effects of this pandemic on schools, on universities. They all had to close down and had to cater to the needs of all of those countless students and teachers throughout the region, especially those who are most vulnerable when it comes to access to education, indigenous communities, women, youth, SIDS. This crisis has also made it quite clear that the system currently has great vulnerabilities. For example, in the cultural sector, because of confinement and lockdown measures, the entire cultural season was shut down. This has had a huge impact on all of the artists and creators throughout the entire phase of the lockdown. Now, also because of some of the technological divide between us and other parts of the world, we haven't been able to take full advantage of the tools that are available for remote learning, remote participation in events, etc. Things that have been available in other countries to try to counter the impact of the pandemic. And so what we have to do is work in a concerted fashion, focusing on solidarity between our countries in order to face the challenges of the pandemic. This is something that we can't do without. We have to make sure that solidarity and cooperativity and dialogue are put at the top of the list and outweigh any other political considerations. We should also avoid any unilateral coercive measures that might stand in the way of turning our response to the COVID pandemic a global priority above all other considerations. We have to do everything we can to foster scientific cooperation in our region and how we can share more and more information in exchanging information on policies that have been implemented and that have succeeded is also something that we need. We also have to fight against misinformation. We have to promote quality news reporting, reliable news reporting that's objective. This is the only way that we can learn from what's been going on in other countries and having a sound response to the crisis. So it's time for us to join in a collective effort to foster solidarity, to break down barriers, and to provide assistance to all those in need. This concerns a right to healthcare and the right to life of all of our peoples. We have to make sure that we can rise to the challenges posed by this emergency and come up with appropriate measures to address it. Dear colleagues, Madam Director General, ambassadors, uh, I'm sure that once we return to normal, we will see ever increasing changes at an ever increasing pace. And what we have to do is make sure that one of the top priorities is the defense of peace in Latin America. This is something that was proclaimed by the entire region when we proclaimed our region an area of peace. So we would count on UNESCO to uh, give its support for future exchanges within our region on all these areas. UNESCO must continue to play a cutting-edge role in raising awareness about the crisis and coming up with sound solutions to address it in culture, education, and sciences, as well as in communication. We recognize UNESCO's leadership role and its ability to mobilize resources and all sorts of efforts in order to make this. This is something that we've seen in UNESCO's response through its network of field offices. They've been working tirelessly in order to mitigate the impact of the crisis. We also believe that the values and terms of reference of this organization put us in the right position to lend to member states the support that they need. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. We shall now move on to the panelist discussions.
Aprovecho solamente para
I would just like to take this opportunity to once again apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we've faced. But we know that this is something that comes with online platforms. These platforms are great tools, but sometimes there are technical glitches. But it's important for us to move on with our program and to make sure that our conversation can cover all the ground we wanted to. And without further ado, I shall now give the floor to Gabriela Ramos, UNESCO's Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences. She shall be acting as our moderator for this panel of participants. Thank you, Julio, and thanks to all of the previous speakers as well. For this first panel, we'll be looking at the perception of Latin American and Caribbean societies when it comes to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have top-tier speakers for this panel. We have Madam Rigoberta Menchú, Nobel Prize laureate from 1992. We also have uh, Alicia Vicini from the Executive Secretariat of ECLAC, which has done such a great job in providing expert input on public policy in the region. We also have Dr. Boya Vitória Sousa Santos from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And also we have His Excellency Abel Prieto, the President of the Casa de las Americas and a former minister in Cuba. So those are the different speakers we have. We should wrap up this panel discussion by 6:30, I would suggest. So we listened to what the Director General has had to say, as well as what the Ambassador of Cuba has had to say. In response to that, I would like to say that beyond culture and education, the issue of disinformation and the sciences, when it comes to the social and human sciences, we've been rethinking the entire issue of social protection. We would like to engage in a dialogue with social policy ministers to see what kinds of support UNESCO could provide as they try to come up with the right policy choices. We have some other tools at our disposal. We'll be talking, we spoke about Resiliarte as Resiliart as one nice possible response to this, but also in the area of sport. There are many possible responses as well. And we're also currently negotiating a text on ethics in artificial intelligence. And this is very important because AI has given us some really useful tools in containing the pandemic, but at the same time, there are hazards associated with the spread of AI. So UNESCO wants to make sure that it's always well positioned to help member states come up with effective solutions to rise to the face the crisis. Now, I would now like to invite Rigoberta Menchú to take this speech. She really is an icon of resilient Latin American women, and so now we will give the floor to her and hear what she has to say.
La Organización de las Naciones Unidas.
Thank you. I would like to thank UNESCO, and I would like to thank the Director General uh, for the invitation to speak here. I would also like to thank Dr. Julio Carranza for his invitation. I greatly appreciate this dialogue that we're having on the different challenges we faced in Latin America and the Caribbean when faced with the COVID-19 pandemic. This has helped us understand the importance of having a common agenda because the pandemic is something that affected the entire globe. This pandemic is really placed humanity at a crossroads. There will be a before and after this. And in particular, it's shown that humankind as a whole is always vulnerable. We human beings are always vulnerable. We have nothing that provides us with an absolute guarantee of health and life. When we look at the effects of neoliberal economic policies, we've seen how this has led to a deepening crisis and how the impact of such crises falls on the shoulders of the overwhelming majority of the world's poor. Exclusion, hunger, these are scourges that basically affect women and children by and large, or indigenous populations. And we're seeing more and more of this translated into waves and waves of people who are desperate as they migrate from one region of the world to another because there is no work for them at home. And what we see is that the actions of the major powers has a direct impact on what's going on in the rest of the world in terms of corruption, economic underdevelopment, etc. And the people of the world are paying the price of such inequality. This is one of the things that most shocked us with the pandemic was all of a sudden fear, this fear that struck in the hearts of everyone that we could lose what was dearest to us. But it also brought about further restrictions on our freedom, on our ability to meet together and to gather together. So this crisis has come at a time in which nation states and cultures, countries have been floored by social crises throughout the world. And Latin America is also engaged in these types of tensions. And one of the biggest things that has not been accomplished is providing the majority of people with uh, sort of decent living conditions. One of the things we saw, for example, is that our hospitals were not designed and built for a lot of people to come, rather for just few people in the privileged classes to go to hospitals and get care. So the idea now is to try to expand the network of available hospital care. One of the things that we also noticed was that for most parts of our country, there are no doctors around. And especially because there weren't that many doctors to begin with, and many of them got sick when they were originally caring for the first people who got the virus. So we don't even have the basic wherewithal to protect our lives against such a virus. So reality has become something that is quite brutal, something that's really hair-raising. And those who've suffered the most are children, again, or the elderly, people who didn't have anything other than a hand-to-mouth existence, working from day to night in order to just eke out a basic living, and yet they cannot withstand such an onslaught of such a virus. No government, no state can or is providing people with a guarantee of protection. And so I think it's very important for us to talk about vulnerabilities and to do something about it. In Guatemala, the situation was utterly unbearable. The overwhelming majority of people could not even rely on one another for assistance. And there's another important problem, and that is global warming. This is something that is having a direct impact on the access to food that people living in rural areas have. The only thing we ever hear about is personal initiatives, but we need more joint initiatives. None of the policies that have been implemented have actually helped us. The overwhelming majority of people remain poor, and this is why people turned inwards, relied on their families, on their local communities, and harking back to traditional approaches, traditional spirituality, reliance on Mother Earth, which was basically the best way for us to cope with the situation. I think it's very important to do everything we can to preserve this type of approach. The pandemic is affected people around the world, not just in Guatemala or the Caribbean. We should take stock of this. It really should be a wake-up call. We have turned to our spiritual leaders, our traditions. We tip our hats off to all of those doctors who did everything they can to help people in need. And many of them also lost loved ones. There's one thing that we should take away from this and something we should be mindful of going forward, and that is the lack of trust, the lack of confidence, the lack of trust amongst people, the lack of reciprocal, healthy, personal relations with our friends, with our families, with our communities. I think that this is why we will all start to have a new awareness of the need for humanism and mutual respect. We all part of a global community, and I think that that is something that we've seen emerging, and this has been very heartening. We've seen this in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm sure that the world's leaders have no choice but to focus on the daily existence of the countless millions around the world that are trying to cope with this. We need to share our experiences in different countries, in different communities, in different villages and towns. Um, we saw just how much desperation there was, but people are resilient, and this is why we still have our we have our confidence in humankind. In the last few decades, we've been talking about what's happening to the climate, to greenhouse gases, etc. This has to change. Uh, the only way to get what we want is through democratic channels. It's the same thing as fighting against impunity. Democracy is the only way, and the voice of the people is the only way. Now, once again, we have no choice but to be protagonists and assume our own agency in doing this, because the future is in our hands, our communities are in our hands, and I am actually quite confident that the world is in a position to respond and to be resilient. I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you for UNESCO for this opportunity, and my best wishes to you all. This dialogue will certainly leave us with a lot of food for thought and some very interesting conclusions, but we still don't know the truth of where the pandemic came from. Was it deliberate, and how did it happen? We can talk about that at some stage in the future, but we see that peoples around the world persevere. They are tenacious, and it's in our hands to do something about this, to share information, to communicate with one another, and to reach out to others around the world through the mainstream media, but also through social networks in order to cope with this crisis. Thank you very much. I wish everybody every success in the world, and it's been a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Pues muchas gracias a Rigoberta por este mensaje pues tan certero, tan atinado,
That was very much
importante,
on
pero
spot.
como siempre pone el dedo
And
en la
as
llaga
always, you've
y
really
también se queda uno
pointed out exactly what the
pensando y
problem is.
optimista en
And
términos
yet,
de
at the same
los
time,
aspectos
the
positivos
message
que
is
funcionan
optimist because you've
de la
talked about the
pandemia en
various
términos de la solidaridad social
positive
en la región,
aspects that had about
por
creating
supuesto,
solidarity in the
además
region,
de que nos ha mostrado
contributing towards
sobre los problemas
empowerment,
que tenemos que abordar. Déjeme
and
darle
making
luego
clear to us
la
what
palabra a
problems
Simón
we actually are
Sekini,
facing. I'd like to give the floor now to
representa
Simon Sekini, who, as I said, is
director de la División de Desarrollo
Director
Social de
of the
las
Division for
Naciones
Social
Unidas
Development
y
of
en la actualidad,
ECLAC.
Simón,
And that's in
eh,
a very useful division right now at this point in time.
me
Simon?
están diciendo que tengo que darle la palabra a
Uh,
Boaventura de Sousa
no, they're telling me
Santos.
that I need to give the floor right now
Perfecto.
to Mr. Boaventura de Souza Santos. So, Dr. De
Sabemos que
Souza
usted es uno de
Santos,
los referentes
we know that
más
you are
destacados
one of the
de la
most
cooperación
important
mundial
names of
y
the
uno
World
de
Social
los
Forum.
autores
And
intelectuales
of course,
más distinguidos de América
you
Latina
represent
acerca
or
del
teach
rol
at
y
one, or you're one of the most
impacto
important scholars of Latin America. So it's a great
del
pleasure
desarrollo
to have
humano.
you here with us. I give you the floor, sir.
Ah, por favor, yo quería mucho estar a escuchar la directora de CEPAL, entonces yo me estaba preparando para oírla, ¿no?
Of ECLAC, and I was looking forward to listening to them talk, and there will be a chance. But can you all hear me? Let me ask you first of all, can you hear me okay?
Muy bien. Mira, yo pienso que hablar de América Latina y del Caribe
Okay, well, I think that when we talk about Latin America and Caribbean, we're talking about a very diverse region. We've just finished a study about the pandemic in Latin America. And what I can tell you is that it is a region which is extremely diverse in terms of performance or statistical information as well. but also in terms of the way in which it offers protection to its people, because we have very different scenario that we're dealing with. You can't compare what's going on in Uruguay with what, for example, is happening in Colombia, or you can't compare Colombia with Cuba, or Cuba with Argentina,
Entonces hay desempeños, o lo que pasa, por supuesto, también en Bolivia.
or the way that things are working in Bolivia. So the performance in different countries can be very, very different. And the lesson that can be learned from the presence of this virus in our lives is that we need to learn lessons from the virus. And one of them is that the state is important. We know, and this is something that Rigoberta had said as well so brilliantly, that this pandemic is happening within another pandemic. And that other pandemic has been going on for 40 years. It's the pandemic of neoliberalism, which has led to cutbacks by states of social policies, to privatization of healthcare, of education, of an underfunding of basic infrastructures that have given the state an incapacity to effectively respond to the pandemic. I would say, in fact, that this is a global problem. I'm here in Portugal. And when I look at this from a Portuguese or European perspective, I can say that the healthcare services would have been more prepared 20 years ago to protect people's lives in a pandemic than they are right now. Many measures, many emergency measures had to be taken in this time because healthcare had been partially privatized in Italy, France, Spain, many countries. We have to think that markets are not everything. The state is important as well. When we look at a pandemic, people didn't turn to the markets to ask for protection. They asked for refuge, protection from the state, and many times the state was not there to offer them that protection they were asking for. Another very important lesson that I think we can learn is that the virus is not democratic at all. Eduardo Galeano said it. His metaphor is more useful than ever when he talked about the open veins of Latin America. And I think that this virus has opened the veins in some places and showed all the different types of discrimination that exists against women, the poor, black people, indigenous people, prisoners. It has aggravated, worsened all the social inequality that was already existing. We can see, if we take a look at two neighborhoods, one upper middle class, one, and in another one in Sao Paulo that might have a death rate of 2%, and then go to a favela where it has a 60% death rate. So we're talking about a world that is filled with inequalities. But that's already quite clear to us. On the other hand, I think that this virus has also showed us how important public policies are. There are countries that were offering protection towards the life of their citizens a bit better than others because they placed priority on life. And then there are other states that have placed priority on the economy above all. And of course, in Latin America, in the United States, in Europe, the UK, we look at how that's happened in those countries, that it's been a complete disaster. If they thought that there could be a prosperous economy based on a world of dead bodies. And if we look at the United States and at Brazil, with already 130,000 people dead, it's a healthcare disaster, a humanitarian disaster, which is already setting up cases that are starting to be appeared before the International Court of Justice. But I think if we look at Latin America, there are other things that we can learn and take hope from. I'm talking here to UNESCO, someone who knows, people who work in the world of knowledge, culture, and art. Because what the virus is actually telling us is that we need to rely on the creativity of communities. Many people, communities that have been abandoned living in favelas from Buenos Aires to Mexico, all of them are trying to figure out some way to protect themselves. Indigenous people, for example, have carried out quarantine on themselves. They're, the indigenous guards as well have been used in certain communities in Colombia to protect the people. There's been distribution of food that has been done by the workers, the Sin Tierra movement in Brazil. People like Rigoberta as well, what she talked to us about, all this is important to take into account because this is something that's been valuable during this time of pandemic, but and hasn't gotten enough attention. Another thing that we're seeing as well is that one of the things we're learning from the pandemic, and there's a word that we could remember in the future, is that if we look at the people themselves and what the indigenous people, the Afro people, the excluded people have been saying all along, and for me it's quite clear that the virus is not our enemy. We live with viruses. That's part of our life. The virus is a teacher, a cruel teacher, of course, because it teaches you by killing you. But here, there's something that's being taught, and what we need to learn is try to think about Mother Earth, as the indigenous people say. Mother Earth is saying to us, please stop your current development model, your mega projects of your open sky mining, of contamination and pollution of the rivers, destruction of the forests. Stop doing that because this is creating an ecological catastrophe out of which more pandemics will arise. All the study that I'm looking at the moment say the same thing, that there's not going to be some new normalcy, but rather periods of pandemic that have to do with this model of development. So if we look at Pachamama, the indigenous people have said to us so clearly and have been telling us for so long that the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. If we look at that, we'll understand things a lot better. So I think when faced with this huge healthcare crisis, we have three possible scenarios. And I'm analyzing all three of them to see what's happening. So let me describe them quite quickly. There's a first scenario, and which is important, or the one that a lot of the politicians or decision makers are looking at, that nothing's going to change, that we'll just go back to the same situation as it was before. We'll go back to what people are calling a new normality. But normality as it was before was a hell for many women. It was a hell for poor people. It was hell for discriminated social groups. But that's normal, and that they say is going to come. And as ECLAC has told us, that if the financial market doesn't change, then debt to cover expenditure related to the pandemic, well, that debt will have to be paid via more debt, more social cutbacks, more cutbacks in education, more cutbacks in healthcare. We can't do that. For 40 years, the states have been enacting cutbacks. Chile was going through enormous social protests just before the pandemic began. The same thing was happening in Colombia. So that just scenario, that just isn't possible. There's a second scenario, which is the scenario perhaps of those who are a bit more enlightened, perhaps to say it that way, which is they say, well, something will change. We're going to have to change a few things, maybe our energy matrix, etc. Because capitalism, as we know it, to make sure that it continues to be profitable. And to do this, we're just going to keep on doing with oil and with gases, with our models of consumption as they've existed up until now. Cities that are completely unlivable as they are right now, and that really nothing's going to change in the future. And I think that would be very unfortunate.
Scenario, con esto termino.
And this is a third scenario, and this is the last thing I'd like to talk to you about, that really points out an alternative, true change in our lifestyle, in modes of production, in ways of living together. And that's where I think Latin America can offer leadership, because our peoples have taught us all of this already. This is a teaching from the ancestors, which is not the past, it's the future. There's the ecological aspect. When we think about Pachamama, about Mother Earth, that's part of what I think can be something for us to learn for the future. And as this book that's going to be available soon, that I believe that we're in a position of paradigm transition towards a new model, because otherwise it's the end of human life on the earth. As you all know, human life is 0.001% of the life of the planet. So this little tiny of what makes up the life of the planet cannot take the risk of endangering all of life on the planet. And that won't happen. The planet will actually destroy us. So we need to make a change. So this change in civilization that has to do with art and culture, knowledge, I think UNESCO has to look at all this as well. To try to make art and culture in a way that's less canonical, less institutional, more accessible to others, so that it reaches neighborhoods and communities. People are alive, singing, making rap, making hip hop. And the studies right now are showing that music, art, and culture is a good remedy towards the mental illness of isolation, of lockdown in this period of time. So there's a huge novel field, in my opinion, that we need to face and look at with a different pair of glasses on. That's what I call the epistemologies of the South, to look at knowledge from the bottom up, of those who have been fighting against capitalism, sexism, and racism. Those battles are out there, and they have been very significant at this point in time as centers of resistance. But those communities are weak. Their hands are tied. We've seen in Colombia that more social leaders have been killed during the pandemic than before. The oppressors have been taking advantage of the crisis in Colombia to aggravate the situation that people are in. The same thing's been happening in Brazil as well. So there's this side of it, which in my hand is very negative, but there's also the positive side of people that aren't just sitting there in fear, but rather are working with hope, as Rigoberto was telling us. Of course, we have to be afraid, because afraid without hope is no good, but hope without fear, that doesn't work either. We need to be responsible. We need to have a balance between our fear and our hope. And I think UNESCO can contribute towards that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Conectado, ¿no? Ahora. Decía yo, doctor, gracias por sus palabras y por obviamente esclarecernos con estos tres.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Thank you for everything that you've said. And since 2008, well, as people said back in 2008, there's nothing worse than squandering a good crisis. Crises come in different sizes. This might be the mother of all crises, however. We'll now hear from Mr. Prieto, the president of the Casa de las Americas, former minister of Cuba. As we listen to the next speakers, let's try to stick to 6 minutes each. Otherwise, we won't have enough time for everyone to speak. Thank you. I would like to thank the Director General and ADG, Gabriel Ramos. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm going to read out to you a summary of all of the texts that I actually wrote out in longhand, and that will be made available at some later time. Now, I've been listening very closely to what was said by what Boaventura was just saying. It overlaps a lot with what I had to say. Same thing with what Rigoberto said. I think that the only positive outcome from this entire tragedy is that it's forced us to put our heads together, to step back from the predominant model of what some people call normalcy, but we call frivolousness, in order to take a long, hard look at the prospects of the human species surviving, not just surviving this virus, but surviving the greed of those who rule the world, the climate crisis that we're facing, the crisis of the exclusion of majorities around the world, and a model that is based on stark inequalities and utter greed. Boaventura was saying that the crisis has been a very cruel teacher. There's no denying that. Many of the lessons we've learned have been hair raising. It's revealed a lot of the shortcomings of our governments. It's also shown us the resilience of certain sectors, artists, creators. Now, in advertising, people have been trying to convince for decades that we live in the best of all possible worlds, sort of like Pangloss. And neoliberal capitalism seems like the only natural solution for human coexistence around the world. This mass brainwashing exercise has been very successful. It's been so successful that even the victims of the neoliberal uh, economic proponents, uh, they don't challenge this system. They buy into it. Now, this pandemic has given rise to a lot of disruptive thought in the social and human sciences. A lot of people have been thinking a lot about the underlying causes and the potential consequences and repercussions of this tragedy. On the one hand, we have the vision of healthcare as a business. This is what the pharmaceutical industry would have us believe, that this is the best model. It's a for-profit system upon which humans around the world, their health depends on this. And some people will have access to this and others won't, depending on how much money they've got. Now, this vision of the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical industry, is completely ill equipped to rise to the challenges of a crisis such as this one. Rigoberto referred to the hair raising realities of our healthcare systems and their ability to attend to the needs of the poorest, of the poor. She was right. This system also is against culture, actually. It seeks to commoditize culture, and that's it. Defending cultural diversity, which has been one of UNESCO's most noble rallying cries, has been thwarted time and again by very powerful, narrow economic interests. Now, the restrictive measures, social distancing, etc., disrupted cultural life in all communities around the world. We saw people working in the cultural sector all of a sudden deprived of any kind of livelihood. This has led to more impoverishment of many people around the world. Boaventura was just talking about this. We could actually see irreparable losses in the field of culture and the arts. Now, as some people were saying, the monopolies of the entertainment industry and internet platforms have seen a sharp increase in their earnings over this same time frame. One of the things that we see despite this, or actually because of this, is just how many indigenous peoples around the world are under increasing threats. Their languages, their cultural traditions are all threatened with extinction. Rigoberta can say this. And yet she said, we've gone back to our traditional knowledge, our traditional spirituality in order to cope with this. This is a completely different world vision, one that isn't predatory, one that isn't seeking to maximize profit. Here we are paying the price of having such an attachment to this actually highly unnatural system. This is also what's giving rise to mankind's onslaught against the world's environment and nature. So we also have to focus on sources of information. The mainstream media haven't given people the proper information. They didn't make people really aware of what's really going on. They've turned their backs on the scientific community. They've looked for uh, news stories that will distract people or will uh, distract people or make them cower in fear without ever addressing the real issue, which is the neoliberal model. Cuba has suffered most bitterly from the campaigns, the media campaigns of those who own the global mainstream media. The United States actually tightened its blockade on Cuba during the pandemic. It has done everything it can to try to disrupt our credit rating, to try to disrupt the activities of our own media and communications abilities. The United States has continued to turn its back on us and has made it impossible for us to buy certain inputs, certain medicines. We've had to deal with the pandemic on our own to a large extent, and we've actually been quite successful. And we've provided assistance to 40 other countries in the world, but often people don't mention this. Please interrupt me when I've reached my 6 minutes. I'm just going to keep going. Have I already spoken for more than 6 minutes? Yes, that's 6 minutes. You have a couple of seconds to finish, though. Okay, well then I'll wrap up right away. What about the post-pandemic situation? Here I had a quote from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who was saying that it's time for us to redouble our efforts in order to build more inclusive and sustainable societies and economies. Now, the text that I'm going to be circulating to you, Gabriela, and to everybody else after this meeting concludes, in that written statement, I tried to forward a series of proposals for education and culture. I think that there's a parallel educational system alongside national education systems. Each country has its own public policies for education, their own school systems. Some of them have more universal access or fee-free access. This is what we have in Cuba because for us, education is seen as being a universal human right without any exceptions. And this is something that we managed to maintain during the pandemic. But despite our educational system, we've got the hegemonic power of the entertainment industry, which has done everything it can to reach out to younger generations, creating false needs, instilling a culture of consumerism. There's one report that I'd like to conclude on. It's from the Special Reporter of the United Commissions on Human Rights, Faria Shahid. This is a study from 2014, and I would recommend that you all give this a careful reading because it talked about the excess of of commercials, of advertisings, techniques like neuromarketing that actually have a direct impact on people's unconscious minds. So what we have to do to have a long-term solution is to make sure that our educational systems can lead to emancipated systems. Thank you, Mr. Prieto. We had a hard time. We didn't choose the list of speakers that we have because we knew that they would all say the same thing. We chose them because we thought they were leading figures in this field. But what we're getting is a very similar message from all of our speakers when it comes to the need to change our development model, which actually placed us in this situation in the first place. We, before I give the floor to the next speaker, I would just like to thank Cuba for its solidarity. During the pandemic, Cuban doctors were sent to other countries, other regions of the world. I think that we should all pay tribute to Cuba and thank them for their efforts to support their brethren around the world. Now we have Simona Sicchini, who have already presented to you 4 times, but I'm going to give the floor now. You are the director of the Social Policy Directorate of ECLAC, which is an illustrious institution that continues to provide all of our governments with the analytical and advisory tools they need to develop their own public policies. You have the floor, 6 minutes. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you on behalf of all of us here. It really is a pleasure for us to participate in this dialogue with this very high-level panel sponsored by UNESCO. As Boaventura Santos was saying, in the region there is a great diversity of different institutions. We have been looking at what's going on in each and every country. So we've been focusing on the epicenter of the pandemic. We now have more than 300,000 deaths. That's more than one third of the global toll. But we should also say that the region was already doing poorly before the pandemic hit. We had enormous structural deficits and challenges which could be put in the matrix of social inequality. What this means is that the overwhelming majority of the population in our region cannot actually exercise their full economic and social rights. 75% or 64% of the employees or people working in the region are in the informal sector. And so you can imagine what this means for countless men, women, children, migrants, etc. All of this goes hand in glove, of course, with social inclusion. And if we look at all of the indicators before the pandemic hit, they were all looking pretty bad. In 2019, annual growth rate was on average 0.4%. Poverty was on the rise. And as you probably remember, as the end of 2019, there were major popular demonstrations throughout many countries in the region protesting living conditions. Now, with the pandemic, I would say that a lot of this dramatic impact that we've seen are basically grafted on tops of these structural issues I've just mentioned. The informal sector, vulnerability, people who don't have access to technology can't work remotely. They suffer from deficiencies and failures in the uh, electrical supply networks, water supply, wastewater, etc. So this has given rise to the most severe economic crisis in the past 100 years. What we've seen as a result is a huge increase in unemployment. Now, faced with this crisis, we can also say that there are very few social sectors that have sufficient savings in order to weather the storm. 79% of the population, that is 491 million people, have uh, incomes that are less than three times the poverty index. So everybody's really living on the edge. Poverty is bound to go up over the next few years, going up by 7% per year. We're looking at the prospect of 230 million people out of work, and more than one half of children, boys, girls, and teenagers are living under the poverty line. We also anticipate that inequality will also increase in terms of income inequality in all of the countries of the region. Now, some new inequalities have emerged as well as those that have just been aggravated by this. Uh, Gender inequality, of course, it's a constant. Women have to bear the burden of raising children, taking care of the family, etc. Most of this hard work is uh, done without any payment at all. Also, women have less access to the use of technology, and in particular, internet. And all of these things are critical tools in this day and age for education and working. But there are 40 million households that have no uh, access to internet, and 32 million children and teens cannot engage in remote learning. So if a school gets shut down, those children in that area will not be given any instruction. That can live to more or higher dropout rates, and then adult unemployment, alas, a lot of prospects for the young people. Parents might also might also experience a loss in earnings. There might also be an increase in child labor as a result because these people have no choice. And all of this is likely to be exacerbated by the pandemic. So the impact on the welfare of children is so clear. Same thing for youth. This is something that could have long-term consequences on their intellectual and spiritual development as well as their material development. And we can't afford to have another lost decade, especially when you think about an education or an entire generation whose decade would be lost because of a lack of access to education at the get-go. I would echo what Rigoberto Menchu said. The pandemic has also s- showed just how important the network of family ties and communities are. But this has also underscored the lack of social protection On the government side, when we look at medical coverage, etc., the state has not been up to the task, and people are rethinking the role of the state in order to make sure that the state can have a resilient response as well. Now, we in ECLAC have done a lot to help government set up emergency funds or a basic emergency wage, how we can further roll out ICTs. But we also recognize that beyond emergency assistance, we need a real change in our development model. Lisa Varstina said this. Instead of talking about reconstruction, we should be talking about transformation of our economic model in order to increase productivity thanks to innovation. In order for this transformation to be successful, we need to continue building a genuine welfare state that's based on universal social rights, based on the principles of solidarity and cost effectiveness, something that will bring about investments in capacity building, reinvesting in families and households, and increasing workers' productivity. Now, in order to build a social welfare system like this, we need to have policies that are universal through things like affirmative action that can open access for the first time to people who have been historically excluded from access to these different services, so that everybody in society can participate on an equal footing. Now, as Abel Prieto has said, we have to continue making investments in education and health as if they're fundamental human rights. That will increase productivity. We should also strengthen universal social protection systems to make sure that they are fully comprehensive. Now, at ECLAC, we have also tabled the notion of a basic citizen wage, something that would be universally open to everybody. We've also talked about perhaps phasing in these policies that would eventually lead to a universal living wage. And then lastly, healthcare. Healthcare is necessary. It's a necessary human right. The pandemic has shown this quite clearly, but we have to do this also to lighten the load of work carried by women. So I would say that this really is an exceptionally deep crisis, and as a result, we should rethink all of our public policies. In the past, talking about a universal living wage was unthinkable. Now people are taking it seriously, and there are new proposals that will also be given attention to, and then in the past they would have been ignored. We have to rethink uh, what we can do to change the social impact of this, and also how we can change the shift, or how we can shift the tax burden to make sure that we get the wherewithal to finance this. Now, in our region, the overall tax burden is much lower than in other parts of the world, and yet we still have high levels of tax avoidance and evasion. Huge amounts of our GDP are lost. So I would leave you with that thought, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation.
La CEPAL, pues con datos, con indicadores, con evidencia respecto del impacto y de los números.
Thank you very much for that information. And as usual, as we always get from ECLAC, lots of data and evidence. And we've got some questions that have already come into some of the speakers. And I think to bring this panel to a close with a common message, perhaps along the lines of how poorly prepared the economic and social systems were in Latin America in facing this pandemic, a landscape in which the lack of equality has been made even worse. Because we've seen that due to the informal nature of much of the society, and this has been mentioned by many of the speakers, that this meant that much of these injustices or more inequalities mean that we're going to be ending up with a continent that is more vulnerable, more unequal, with a social gap that will have to be dealt with. So we've got factors that have to do with the most affected sectors. I think that's very easy to answer. We can say it's tourism, entertainment, raw or raw materials as well, remittances, and sectors where women work in or live in most. And we could see that the financial crisis also affected, where the financial crisis affected mostly places where men were to be found. Here we're seeing that this is affecting women more. But I do want to finish with one question, ask each of our speakers to just take 2 minutes. And I know that's a challenge to stick to 2 minutes, but could you tell us what factors, and we'd like to hear a positive message, what factors do you see that exist in the region that could give us some hope that this change of paradigm of economic development might actually happen? What conditions would need to be present so that we could turn this crisis around and create societies which are more equal in nature, more united, more resilient, which at the end of the day is really what we're trying to achieve. I'd like to begin in the same order, first with Dr. de Souza Santos, later then Simone, excuse me, later Abel, and then Simone. But I would like to thank you very much for the other questions that we've had, but we've got 6 minutes just to see whether or not we can get an answer to the question I've asked, and then we'll move on to the next panel. So just 2 minutes. Go ahead, please, Boaventura. Well, I'll be quite quick then. I think that the first condition
mirar que la
is to make sure that, to understand that public policy is important in Latin America because it's a continent that in the first decade of the 2000 had certain development models which had problems. One can be quite critical with them, but which were trying, in any case, to eliminate the social gap that existed and eliminate poverty. They didn't want to change the economic system or the tax system or political system. It wasn't that, but it was a first attempt that failed. So we have to take a look at this history again because it can be forgotten very quickly. It has to be taken into account. Secondly, we have to, for once and all, show how significant the imperialistic intervention of the United States has been. We can't describe it in any other way. If we look at Bolivia, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Venezuela, without taking that into account, it can't be understood, the embargo on Cuba, what's happening in Mexico. We can't understand that unless we take into account an imperialist intervention that is trying to prevent any democratic steps taken by the countries. Take a look at Bolivia and what's been happening. They artificially create political crises. And many of the recent cases are perfectly documented. And that's another factor that makes things very difficult. And secondly, if we are able to do what I've mentioned before, we need to learn from what's happened to us and learn together with the Afro and indigenous and countryside communities, the people who are the guardians of biodiversity, because 75% of the diversity is in their regions. They're the guardians of the future. That's why Pachamama is not part of our past. It's part of our future. Thank you very much. A fantastic message. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to Abel. I think that Boaventura said something which was absolutely fundamental. Our people of the Latin American and Caribbean have a common enemy, which is indeed that empire that wants us divided. They want to divide us and they want to see us divided. They don't want us to ever be what Bolivar and Martí and others dreamt for, which was one common spiritual family working together in solidarity. In Latin America, we've been able to achieve fantastic things which many people don't know about. The miracle operation, for example, where millions of people in Latin America and Caribbean were operated, whose eyes were operated on, eyes that would be, or operations that would be very expensive in private clinics. There are people who had problems with their retina caused by diabetes, for example, who were blind, didn't have the money that they needed to have the operation they needed, and work was done. beginning with Fidel and Chavez, Cuba and Venezuela, did work that was carried on by other countries in Latin America and Caribbean. We've done things. Our literacy method, for example, was able to eliminate illiteracy in many regions. I can remember in Cochabamba in Bolivia, for example, there was an event where we wanted to give the people their literacy diplomas to indigenous peoples, very old indigenous people that began to learn to read when they were very old. Why did they want to learn to read at that age? Is it that they wanted greater opportunities on the job market? No, it had to do with personal dignity. It was beautiful to see. To show those people, so elderly already, how proud they felt when the moment when they got their literacy certificate. And this all has to do with human dignity. And our America must, to respond to the question that Gabriela made, the advantage we have is our deep going cultural connections, our traditions. We've got this core of indigenous people, this core of Afro-descendants, this diversity that we have within this incredible unity that we also have. It's horrible that we've got these pockets of incredible poverty, that we're suffering from a system that is so unfair. In my opinion, if first of all, if our common enemy let us work and focus on creating these cultural connections that actually have always been there. They've never been broken. They've never been broken. They're very powerful, but they've been weakened. And there's been intention behind that. They've tried to divide us. And I think that Latin America has a calling since its very origins, its most ancient traditions, to unite ourselves as a family of nations. I think we would be much stronger in this 21st century. That seemed to be beginning with this catastrophe we're going through right now, but we could face the challenges of a world with pandemic. Or as Boaventura said, it may not be just this pandemic, but others. And if that's what happens, we could do a lot. We people of the Latin American Caribbean, that is blocked to us today. And it's that simple. Thank you, Abel. Now, Simone.
Gabriela, gracias. Mira,
Thank you, Gabriela. I could give a brief answer from the perspective of public policy by saying that when we talk about social economic policies, up until just recently, we were talking about details, but this pandemic has really opened up a box for new debate on public policy, and we've got a great opportunity for transformative change. We also are talking about a region that's young, a population which is more educated, more empowered, and more demanding than it was in the past. So there are issues around the environment, for example, social justice, economic justice, that the people are leading the fight in. And I mentioned those protests that were happening already in the last year in a few different countries. So there is space for social compacts. If you take a look at what was happening in Chile, they were trying to see whether or not they could change a constitution which was written during a dictatorship. And obviously it was not focused very much on economic and social rights. So it's the time to think about how we can change things on a big scale and how we can create systems of welfare in the region. If we look at Europe, for example, William Beveridge in the Second World War was the one who instituted the universal healthcare system in the UK at that particular point in time. And I think in UN, ECLAC, we have to deal with the fact that there's a complicated situation. There's a certain pessimism of the intelligence of seeing how complicated the situation is, but the optimism of the will, recognizing that there is an opportunity to create a region where there's more justice and more solidarity. Thank you.
Y creo que bueno con estos mensajes.
Thank you. And I think with those messages, I would like to bring this first panel to a close. I'd like to thank you very much. You've given us some very important things to think about. What I am taking with me is the importance to think about the welfare state in Latin America and what the role of the state is, which obviously has lost power to a certain extent. We have to think about making sure that we have resources and the ability to be able to fulfill the responsibility that we have towards people, but also like the idea that Simone talked about, a change in public policies, not moving back to what was normal before, but rather to learn the lessons of history and what it teaches us. What we heard from Boaventura as well as Abel, to remember our history, the knowledge of the diversity of our traditions, all when trying to create greater dignity and always in respect and solidarity. These are messages that offer great hope, and I would now like to give the floor to my dear colleague, Fernand Matoko. And I'd like to thank you as well, because Fernand and Julio were the ones who had the idea of this day today, and I'm one of the ones who's getting the greatest advantage from this and being here. So last comment, we're going to talk about sport as well, and art and sport. And sport is an area where UNESCO also has a lot to do to try to recreate social fabric. So thank you very much for your attention.
Gabriela, Julio. ¿Está Julio?
Julio, can you hear us?
Bueno, para hacer la transición. Bueno, ok. Vamos. Muchas gracias, Gabriela.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Distinguished panelists, people who are listening on Facebook or on the webcast, or on the platform that we're using today, good afternoon to all of you. As Professor Boaventura said, Latin America and the Caribbean presents a great diversity. One reality that we see in the region, there are some countries that don't speak Spanish. There's some that speak French. So, bonjour to all of you who are connected in Haiti, and thank you for being here with us.
Good afternoon, good morning for those who are connected from English-speaking countries from the Caribbean. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today and to share some of the thoughts about the consequences of the pandemics in your region. Entonces,
I'd like to give the floor to our first speaker, Ms. Saskia Sassen, who's connecting from the United States, well known in the continent, in the region, who has been studying social policies, won the Prince of Asturias Award for Social Sciences in 2013, and is professor of sociology at Columbia University. I don't know if she'll be speaking in Spanish or in English, maybe in Spanish, but the floor is yours in any case, Ms. Sassen.
que hay un problema técnico con la
There might be a technical problem with Ms. Sasson.
It's a pleasure to introduce Miss Michelle Miko. She's a professor of urban planning and at the University of McGill, at McGill University. Welcome to this panel. You have the floor, unless you speak in Spanish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a correction. I am from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
so I reside in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so good day to colleagues from across the Latin America and Caribbean region and Europe and Africa. I bring the Caribbean perspective on the impact of COVID-19 and in particular the perspective of small island developing states. As we know, the Caribbean is very diverse, and we know that some of the countries of the region have been impacted differently based on their own resource profile. What we have recognized in terms of impacts is that the impacts range from economic to social, environmental impacts. And I want to start by first looking at the economic disruption that has been caused. Most of us are familiar that the small islands are quite vulnerable to external shocks because their economies are indeed quite small and they are open economies. What we have found is that at an initial glance, because some of the data has still to be collated and assessed, is that there has in fact been a worsening of poverty, in that there is a poverty trap, which is very real for the poor and the marginalized. They have really been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. We've also found that there is a spiraling of unemployment in the labor-intensive tourism sector. Hotels, the cruise ship industry, the airline industry, and the entertainment and the cultural industries have all been impacted. What is interesting, though, is that many of our visitors come from the two most affected countries, the United Kingdom and the USA, so that those persons coming from those countries unable to travel would have directly impacted on our tourism sector significantly. And yes, there is a question that the pandemic occurred outside the peak months of the tourism season, but we also saw the effects of regional tourism declining drastically because of the closure of our borders. In the case of the small business sector, the small business sector has been severely impacted. The informal economy has, of course, been severely disrupted by the pandemic. And in terms of food security, we find that some islands that have depended on imported food supplies, such as the Bahamas, have had to now turn to looking at the ways of addressing the shortfalls in food supplies, etc. The health sector has been affected in that the already struggling health sector in some of the islands of the region have been, the sector has been overburdened by the number of persons who may have had to be hospitalized or been transferred to ICU units or high dependency units. And the other impacts that are equally important in terms of the economic disruption is that we are likely to see an inflationary impact on food items, consumer durables, impacts on the housing sector to come. And there will be a reduced personal savings and reductions in remittances from persons living abroad, especially those that live in the USA, United Kingdom, and Canada. Government borrowing is likely to increase. We are going to see higher deficits, and we've already been seeing a reduction in the payments made through the social safety nets. I can't begin to tell you the cost of sanitizing government offices and how that has affected on government's budgets over budgetary outlays over the last couple of months. There are, of course, other impacts. The social impacts are equally important. We've seen a rise in reported cases of domestic violence. We've seen also that there is a gendered power imbalance in that in very early stages of the pandemic, the top level decision makers were largely men as opposed to women, which I think was which was a bit short-sighted, because women were very much at the front lines of the in the early stages of the pandemic. We are also finding that the psychological impact of the COVID-19 on people in general is increasing, but also particularly amongst women, children, and the elderly. Again, the science has to bear this out, but we are hearing anecdotally that, you know, these are some of the psychological impacts on these particular groups. There is also, interestingly, because of the closure of beaches and parks, limited access to public and recreational spaces. And that has a tendency to also have an impact on person's psychological health. We've also noted that the elderly have been saying that the access to churches is affecting them. The closure, there is very little closure at funerals where family and friends normally convene in sending off their beloved ones. So there are some psychological effects that are appearing, and we need to take these into account. The education sector has been affected. I think the digital divide has certainly been exacerbated, and it's affecting poor households in particular. The long-term repercussions of these types of social issues stemming from limited access to technology can lead, in fact, to an increasing number of dropouts and a higher incidence of crime. And then I'd like to look very closely at some of the environmental impacts. Some of the environmental impacts noted include limited state capacity to monitor informal development in environmentally sensitive areas. We've seen areas where large areas of forest have been cleared because the state has not been able to venture into these areas during the pandemic to curtail illegal logging and so on. And there are, of course, other impacts that are under study at the moment at the university in terms of the actual repercussions. But I wanted to turn quickly to the positive impacts. I think there are opportunities for transformation and sustainable development in the future for the region. Some businesses have already shown that they have become more innovative. There is also a rapid transformation to conduct business using digital technology. There is the agricultural sector is getting a boost in terms of more people gravitating to farms, and that has benefits for food security and reducing the dependency on food imports. We've also seen where there is free Wi-Fi access for university students, free Wi-Fi hotspots for students at all levels. That's been made available, and that's an economic benefit for many students. The main environmental benefits would be that the marine resources have been able to recover because of less tourism. There's less air pollution because of less commuting, and there's less vehicular traffic on the road. So there are some environmental benefits that have come out of the pandemic. And of course, at the social level, less stress levels because of less traffic congestion, more time spent with families. And there have been new modalities for teaching that benefit children, such as access to public TV and radio, where information packages and educational tools are being made available to all children, regardless of their economic backgrounds. So I think progress towards achieving the UN SDGs may be a bit off track, will be off track, but the challenge is for us to refocus on forging new pathways for sustainable development. I think an optimistic outlook is an essential ingredient in going forward. And disruption is sometimes good for societal reset, but we must ensure that we leave no one behind. It must not be at the expense of the poor and vulnerable. And in closing, I want to say that there is room for a paradigm shift in policy in the Caribbean, which is grounded in science and sound research. And at the end of the day, I think the Caribbean has shown that it is capable of innovation and resilience in the way in which we've dealt with climate change and the natural hazards and economic disruption for many decades. And I think this is certainly no less a time when we can work together collaboratively to forge a new pathway forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, we do appreciate this contribution for the West Indies, for that region. And two things that you said are very important. I think that you mentioned the social impact, especially the increase on domestic violence. We've seen that even in other regions, including Europe. Women being the most vulnerable and victims of this crisis. And also something that we have not yet been able to measure, the psychological impact of the pandemic, especially to children. That we'll see in future what has been the impact of this crisis on the social mind of our children. Voy a dar la palabra al señor Pablo Gentili de Argentina, de la Comisión Nacional de Cooperación con la UNESCO. Muchas gracias, bienvenido.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Pablo Gentili, from Secretary of Educational Cooperation in Argentina. Well, thank you. I would like to thank you, sir, and also thank the Director General and also Gabriela for coordinating the first panelists. Warm greetings to all of the participants. For me, this has been an exceptional conversation for the time being, under exceptional circumstances around the world. This is the most severe economic crisis that the global economy has faced since the Second World War. 90% of the world's economies, national economies, have shrunk drastically. We're looking at an overall global drop of 5%. And the effect of this in Argentina is something that we've already seen. It's quite dramatic and will be so going forward. We've seen the largest economic slowdown in decades. GDP in the region is estimated to go down by a little more than 6% throughout Latin America, the lowest rate since 1950. This is a region, as we all know, lives from primary the raw materials, and the drop in the prices of raw materials in global markets is going to have a huge negative impact, making the economic crisis that much worse. This is going to lead to economic contraction in many countries, with the output decreasing by over 10%, with, as I said, a region-wide average of about 5–6%. Now, despite the progress that was made at the beginning of the 21st century in Latin America on the front of greater levels of democracy, but the social crisis that we're facing now is something that is unprecedented. We see rising numbers of unemployed people, underemployed people, people who were employed in very precarious jobs in the informal sector, with countless millions in extreme poverty. In fact, more than 50 million new people will be joining the ranks of the poor in the region. And there were many countries at the beginning of the 21st century that felt that they had really gone a long way towards eliminating extreme poverty. Brazil, Argentina, etc. And we're going to see a very high level of people living under the poverty line, probably up to 230 million. And in fact, we will have around an increase from 70 million to 100 million people in the region that are living in extreme poverty. So we have never seen a challenge greater in Latin America than the fight against inequalities. And if you look at the impact of this health crisis, this public health crisis on our societies, we can see the failures to protect people's very lives. This is a pandemic that is exacerbating all of these divides, exacerbating divides that have existed for a long time, these structural uh, problems. And the pandemic shouldn't make us stray our attention from the underlying causes of this, but the primary concern now is to address the public health crisis. Now, one thing that this caught us by surprise at the beginning of the year, we had a new government under Alberto Fernandez who had just came into office, and he said, look, the economy will always bounce back, but human lives cannot be recovered. And so immediately there was a policy that was implemented to focus on protecting human lives and public health. But at the same time, we're developing a strategy to counter inequalities. And this is something that Argentina, that we'd already had as part of our national landscape prior to the pandemic. Poverty and inequality in our region and in our country is something that makes it that much more difficult for us to face the crisis. All of these problems will increase. The increases in violence across the board, of course, but in particular domestic violence. This is the type of violence that has the greatest impact on young people, on youth people. We're seeing all of the other vulnerable groups suffering more and more, indigenous groups with racism running amok. As Michel Nico was saying, we're seeing how this is paying out in microcosms, in SIDS. We are seeing societies entering deep, deep social and environmental crises. And we see the privileges that are retained by those people. The contrast becomes all the more stark in times of crisis like this. Those who are at the upper part of the pyramid of wealth and the oligarchies that run the countries. And one of the basically fundamental thrusts of what we should be doing is fighting against unequal access to education. And this is something that Nicolas Torta has been doing within the national government of Argentina. We have to fight against and break down access, barriers to access in education so that everybody has equal access to education, because this is what gives us the possibility of giving our citizens the wherewithal to uphold their fundamental human rights, the right to liberty, the right to freedom, but also the right to earn a livelihood. Now, this type of unequal access to education isn't just something we see in Latin America. It's something that we see in other parts of the world, but it's something that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, of course. In the new government in Argentina, we've tried to do some important policy changes. First of all, we want to make sure that all learners and teachers have access to educational opportunities. There are many children and youth who have no access to internet, for example. They have very weak connections, but as the Director General said, in her statement, we should be making it possible for everybody to have free access to data on all platforms. That's nice to say, but in actual facts, it's something that is quite a challenge. But we should be focusing on both digital pathways to education as well as non-digital pathways. In Argentina, we see internet as essential public service. And so we want to guarantee access to all different platforms and people from all different social classes. And this is particularly important in an epoch of pandemics when we have to close down our schools, when people cannot attend class in the classroom. So we're trying to do everything we can to make sure that we can continue to provide educational opportunities to young people and children across the country, regardless of the economic condition. We're also deeply concerned to see these strategies of reopening schools don't do anything to counter existing inequalities. There's a need. We have to defend public education and not just think about educational strategies that seem to deepen the onward march of privatization of educational opportunities in the world. Privatization of education in Latin America has not given any glimpse of a working strategy that's going to increase access. Rather, this type of approach has actually perpetuated the sense of privilege handed down from one generation to the next, and it means that only those people who have the wherewithal to pay for quality education can get access to it. So the pandemic is something that should open eyes to all of these different problems, help us now learn how to use all of the existing technological solutions that we have and make them available to everybody in the country. But we have to develop public platforms of access to educational content. And I say this because just putting things, just because technology is available, but it's all in the hands of major multinational corporations, long term, this could turn into something that might actually have a regressive impact on educational access or access to educational opportunities rather than a progressive impact. We've been working with a host of different organizations. We've gotten a lot of support from UNESCO, for example, the regional office, in order to defend the principle of public investment in education. This is not the time to start divesting from public education. We have to do everything we can to step up and invest in education. That's what we're doing in Argentina, because if we don't see any increases in investment in public education, we are not going to be able to turn the tide against the historical patterns that we've inherited. We have to give our support to all of those educational workers, all of those teachers, all of those learners, everything they've been doing, teaching people out of their own homes if need be. We can see that people working in education often in Latin America are women. And we talk a lot about the problems that they have in their own families, the huge amount of responsibility that they carry on their shoulders while they continue to carry out their duties as teachers. Now, just to conclude, three things that I'd like to focus on. Access to scientific data. All of UNESCO's strategies in this field, open science, all of this is of vital importance. We have to preserve it. And Gabriel also mentioned another principle that we are trying to do in concrete terms, focusing on the ethical dimensions of AI and the consequences that AI might have on human rights, gender discrimination, the plight of vulnerable minorities, etc. We have to think about the ethical dimensions of AI. And lastly, to strengthen cooperation internationally in the field of education. The former Minister of Cuba, Culture Minister of Cuba, the current President of Casa de las Americas, says you don't have to be rich to cooperate. Cuba has developed health and educational cooperation programs around the world, and we shouldn't think about cooperation internationally as just a one-way street where we're getting resources from the north. No, we have to think about everybody's capacity to cooperate. Of course, who's going to be bearing the price of this crisis? Now, we in Argentina have a very clear position is that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the poor don't bear the brunt of this. That's often been the case, but we want working people around the world, the people of our countries, not to have to bear the full cost of this crisis, especially because the crisis has been exacerbated by a system that brings crisis all the time. And we should try to change that model. Thank you.
Muy interesante también recordar el tema de la
crisis. And I also very called upon by what you said about the issue of violence exercised upon young people, on women, and above all, on the people.
ya son
Those people who are already marginalized by the economy because they don't have rights to education. They don't have all the same rights that others enjoy. But we've got with us as well Mr. John Anton Sanchez. Hi to you, John. Welcome. He's a professor at the University of the Bolivarian University of Quito in Ecuador, and who I'm sure is going to be talking to us about the issue of the issues affecting the Afro-descendant peoples. You know, we're in the decade of the Afro-descendant people. 5 years have passed. I would like to hear about what progress has been made, but also I don't want to necessarily anticipate what you might be talking about. Go ahead, John. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Dr. Fermin, and thank you to all the colleagues for helping us to be able to set up this connection as well. And here we are. And if we're here, that means that the Orishas and the ancestors are blessing us to give us these opportunities. Indeed, I very much agree with what's been said by the people who spoke before me, Mr. Boaventura de Sousa's criteria, where he talked about the fact that this pandemic is giving us the chance to think about the model of neoliberal bourgeois state and its subjective liberal model. And at least if we think about the different Afro-descendant and indigenous people, that model has failed because it's a model of democracy and of state which has been in the service of capitalism, which has served the interests of the large bourgeoisie, of which we, the Afro-descendant people, are not a part. So we would support that a post-pandemic world should give us the opportunity to think about something new, because this democracy, this model of state and capitalist development has not worked for us. COVID has made it clear how deep going the inequality is, the lack of services that are offered, the lack of services offered to people such as Afro-descendant people. And this is also mentioned by ECLAC. And we see that there's a lack of rights, a lack of citizenship for Afro-descendant people. But we're also surprised to see to what extent some problems that Necessaire in Martinique had made about modernity in Europe have shown up once again. We're seeing the ultra-nationalism, xenophobia, racism, and neo-Darwinism, authoritarian governments, in what Achebe Bende, the great African speaker, called necropolicy, necropolitics. The states have left the citizens to their fates. It's the law of the jungle. I can't remember if it was in a metro somewhere in the US or in the UK where a white citizen was sitting down with their mask but wasn't wearing it. And then another person who was an African descendant got near the person and put on their mask. And the white person put their mask on, and the person said, "Oh, so you've seen that a black person has come near you, you don't put on your mask. A black person comes near and you put on your mask, but when a white person comes by, you don't put on your mask." This just lets us to see to what extent the lack of equality is being exacerbated. Racism is being exacerbated. So we have a lot of concerns that the global economic crisis might end up worsening the situation of indigenous and Afro-descendant people. There could be problems of hunger, malnutrition, increase of conflicts and violence that has to do with lack of resources. We might see an increase in problems of access to water and food. There would be greater forced migrations to cities and to other countries in search of work, all of which could be lethal results for Afro-descendant people, which in this decade, as Dr. Miyoko said, we're talking about justice, reparation. So what do we think is important? What do we think that we need to that we need to deal with the problems with debt and injustice that exist in humanity due to racism and slavery? And that's, for us, a most important point. We believe in the post-pandemic world. the Western world needs to seriously talk about reparations to the descendants of Africans. We're talking about reparations where we would truly become citizens, that we could have access to the rights that citizens have, the rights to healthcare, housing, education, to healthy development, to a healthy environment, to equality, in such a way that, well, what we think is that in this forum, we need to think about a post-pandemic world that will allow for the creation of what we Afro-descendants truly want: reparations, recognition as people, justice so that we can have equality of rights, and development in a model of development that is not necessarily capitalist in nature. However, at the end of the day, we do have a few recommendations. We think that the issue of statistical data is very important. We're concerned about the way in which nation states are dealing with this data and have excluded the uh, aspect of whether or not a person is an Afro-descendant or indigenous person when gathering information about COVID. So if you don't know how it's directly affecting Afro-descendant and indigenous people, how are you going to foster policies based on inclusion? We think that we need to change the liberal democracy model and the model of capitalist development and the capitalist state that at the end of the day is not inclusive for ethnic and racialized minorities and for Afro-descendant people. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, John. Me parece que este mensaje no quiere más explicación por las personas, para las personas que viven en este continente.
John, I think it's quite clear that for people who are living on this continent, there's unfortunately a situation that we're hearing about, the fact that the African descendant people are affected very much more. And this is unfortunately something in that there are people who are forgotten in many countries and many regions. And as John said, the pandemic has worsened the social differences in the people that live on the continent. Some questions have arrived us via chat. And as we did in the first panel, I would like to give the floor to the speakers again to answer them. Above all, there's some questions that has to do with young people, the youth. So they're talking about the future of youth, of education. And as Pablo said, lack of equality in education is an important issue. This was also mentioned by the former Ministry of Culture of Cuba. This issue of universal education, these are very important issues, and the pandemic has shown to what extent these issues are very important when thinking about these new models that you're all suggesting, new paradigms, new models. And of course, education is going to be a fundamental issue in these new paradigms. So I'd like to give you all maybe 2 minutes, just offer some words about this issue. And I'd like to begin with Ms. Michelle Miko. Are you still with us? You've got 2 minutes.
Conclude again.
So as an educator myself at the tertiary level, I think that this is an opportune time for young people to see what role they can play in transforming our societies. I think the issue of relevance of education is going to be a critical one, that people who are embarking on a journey of tertiary education in particular see that education must be relevant to meeting their society's needs. In the Caribbean, we have been well known for producing people for export. Many of our best graduates go to North America and Europe after they've graduated, courtesy subsidies of the region. So I think this is a good time for young people to ask themselves what will be their role in contributing to the development of their societies in the region in which they live.
Thank you very much. Pablo?
Thank you. I think this is really a fundamental issue because, as has already been said during this meeting, the impact of the pandemic on young people must be added to what's already going on in terms of discrimination, production of inequalities, and abandonment that already exists in Latin America. It's young people who suffer the largest amount of violence, has been pointed here, those cities that are built on racism, where the working class and lower class people, especially the non-white people, the ones who are suffering from that, and that's something that can't be doubted at all. But we also need to take into account in this context of the pandemic, young men and women have developed a whole series of very creative strategies around communication and exchange, even when they were not able to leave their homes. So I think one big challenge that we've got perhaps is to see whether or not we can extend the participation of young people in public policy and listen to what they have to say. The work that UNESCO does, for example, around young people is very important because it must be duplicated in the public policies carried out in our countries, not only responding to the demands and needs of public action to try to turn around the situations of poverty and inequality, but also thinking about the right of education of young people. But not just that, but also creating spaces for visibility, for expression, to give voice, to take action by young people within public policy. And this pandemic is giving us huge challenges, but also huge opportunities. We have to come up with strategies for mobilization of young people which are more active than in the past and more deep going, and that allow for us to show that it's not the young people who receive public support, but are those who can help to draft and design them in a new way to shore up the common rights that have been denied them up until now. Thank you very much. John, please. Are you still there? John Anton? Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. The issue of education youth is one of the basic demands of the 180 million Afro-descendants in Latin America and the Caribbean. We could also talk about the indigenous people. The system of education has excluded us, has excluded our young people, and that helps us to understand that we've got the highest figures of illiteracy in the region, and that also means that we have low income. And how can we have access to our cultural, social, and economic rights in such situation? So we're asking for two basic things in terms of education for our young people. One, that it should be quality education, and secondly, it's one that should also take into account our situation, because we know that the quality of our education is not the best. Access to internet, for example, the conditions of basic infrastructure in the schools, the low conditions or the poor condition of food and nutrition for our young people, both in cities and the countryside, are determining factors for the fact that we have lower levels in math, social sciences, natural sciences, etc. So we think that we need to improve the quality of the education for Afro-descendant people. But the other issue is education with identity. We don't actually understand the history of Africa and of our own identity, and Africa doesn't understand the history of the Afro-descendants. Amongst Afro-descendants, it's almost as if we're wandering in the desert because the majority of them deny the possibility of including such information in the school curriculum. And also we believe that access to university is important. If you don't have access to the university, you can't access to development. And there's a very good statement that says education is the way to obtain freedom, and ignorance leads you to slavery. And I hope that UNESCO will continue to support, as it has in the past in some countries in Latin America, especially in Ecuador, where I've seen it myself. I hope that it will continue to support this basic need that we Afro-descendants have of being able to get into university, get high quality education, and to have one that is pertinent, that takes into account our identity. Thank you very much. Thank you, John. And thank you to all of you as well for having been here with us. I'd like to give the floor to Julio. Thank you very much, Matoko. I feel like I need to say that this has been excellent dialogue, but of course with some technical problems, which is kind of inherent in the way we're trying to do this. So there was Ms. Sakya Sassen who was not able to get online with us, but we will be able to keep in contact with her online as well. The people who spoke with us directly that we can see here on screen, there's many people who are connected via Facebook because the different UNESCO offices have been transmitting this meeting via Facebook. The messages that get to me show that there really are a lot of people who are participating by Facebook and YouTube. I would like to very quickly, maybe in 5 minutes, give a summary of what I think is the most important that we've heard today, but taking into account that this is recorded, so we will be drafting a summary and the reports that are needed so that we can try to extract as much of the wealth of information that was given to us in the day of today. I think there was an agreement among the first speakers, the DG of UNESCO, Ms. Audrey Azoulay, as well as the director of GRULAC, Ms. Esquivel, about the fact that this crisis has had an impact on a region that we know in terms of income is one that suffers from the greatest inequality on the planet. And this inequality has increased. The levels of poverty have gone up. If we compare to a previous decade where those levels had been going down, there was a moment of enthusiasm in Latin America, as Abel talked about, but as a result of the most recent processes and the impact that this pandemic has had, there's been a move backwards in this indicator, which is this movement of trying to reduce the amount of poverty and injustice in Latin America and create greater space for human rights, because we know that one of the biggest violations of human rights is actually this pandemic. There was an image that I think will remain in my memory about one of the important contributions of this dialogue, where Mr. Boaventura de Souza Santos said that this pandemic, with everything that it brings, is a teacher. And he said, a cruel teacher who has come to show us with the naked truth of the problems we have and the need to overcome those problems. And as Bel Prieto said, that one of the positive aspects of this crisis is that there has been a onslaught of imagination and creativity and fantasy and demands for dignity, especially coming from those sectors which have been most affected by the pandemic. And I think that this dialogue is actually an expression of this outpouring of thought, and we need to continue via exchanges, and especially with the actions worked out in this field. People have also talked about the imaginary of the people that we heard both by Rigoberto Menchú as well as Mr. de Souza Santos, where we talk about the special relation that the indigenous people have together with nature. As Abel said, it's not a relationship of a predator, but one of love. And this has practical implications in terms of how a civilization needs to relate to nature. One big thinker in Latin America said that nature is not something that we inherit from our parents, but something that we borrow from our children, that we have to return to them in such a way that they can enjoy it and that responds to a human condition. The impact of the virus, as said by Mr. De Souza Santos, the impact is not democratic. It mostly affects the most vulnerable populations, indigenous and Afro-descendant people, as well as women, and that this can be showed that by that the crisis itself systematically is showing us.
This crisis was something that we couldn't gauge at the outset, but now we have a better understanding of how it's working. And this applies to our understanding as a medical emergency and also its social impact. Many of the panelists said that we have to do everything we can to keep Latin America from experiencing another lost decade. And that's why several panelists stress the importance of bolstering up the strength of the state and public policy as a fundamental plank on the platform for success. The pandemic has shown just how important it is for us to go back to the state as the main uh, instrument within our democratic societies to address uh, crises such as this one, especially on behalf of the most vulnerable sectors of our society. Many people have said that there's a serious problem in Latin America when it comes to income distribution, and we all know that. There's one figure that's quite telling was the tax burden in Latin America is 22% of the GDP, whereas in the developed world, despite all the problems they have better wherewithal, better tools to protect their societies. Well, their tax burden is 37%. Now, I'm in Guatemala, the average, or in Latin America, the average is 22%, but here in Guatemala, it's only 10%. That's the tax burden. And this has a direct impact on the state's ability to implement public policies that will offer protection and guarantee protection to those who are most vulnerable. Another important aspect when it comes to this very cruel teacher is that policy is something that has to be used. Now, a markets can be a great way of organizing society, but they have to be kept under control by state authority. Michel Macron spoke about how this has had an impact on the small island developing states. All of those of us who have seen this, we are all we all know how each one of these islands has its own specific set of challenges that it faces. Climate change has had an impact on everybody in the world, of course, but especially on these small island developing states. And this is something we see quite clearly in the Caribbean. All we have to do is look at the statistics. I'm not going to refer you to them right now, but if we want to measure gauge the impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable sectors, she said that there would even be long-term psychological trauma, a long-term impact on the intellectual development of children, prospects for women, etc. That is, an entire generation of poor people could be affected by this because they would be denied the educational opportunities they need in order to escape from poverty. Without education, uh, we cannot have sustainable development. And that's why we have to do everything again to narrow the digital divide, the educational divide, to make it possible for young people to find ways to cope with this. And with this would bring me on to another special consideration, and this is what Pablo Gentili was talking about when it comes to education, and especially distance learning. Here there's a huge divide, and this makes it very difficult for uh, afterwards getting funds going back into schools again.
A lo que era.
Schools will have to change in the future. We have to increase, therefore, our investments in education and in schools in order to fight against educational inequalities. Yesterday, we read in the newspapers that there is a huge risk of up to 40% of people dropping out of school this year in Guatemala. If that were to happen, we would be compromising the future of the country. John Anton referred to the specific issues that Afro-descendants faced. And he was speaking not just about Afro-descendants, but also indigenous populations as well. COVID has shed a very cruel light on what has been going on in these communities that who've seen a model that is foreign to them imposed upon them and leaving them with no room to breathe, not even the possibility of recognizing their own dignity and identity as peoples. Now, this is something that in humane terms is unacceptable and must be changed. John Anton, I'm saying this to strengthen what he said, I would just refer to something that Pope Francis said, and he was in fact referring to this when he said that the current economic model kills, and therefore it must be changed. We also have to do everything we can to put an end to racism. We should be thinking in terms of reparations to Afro-descendants for the systematic and repeated injustices that they suffered under slavery and that have not disappeared with the passage of history. There are other models that aren't perhaps classical forms of slavery, but nonetheless reproduce those social patterns. That's why we see people around the world now clamoring for an end to racism and an era of racial justice. I would say that the message has been very objective. The pandemic has really made us open our eyes and see the facts in the face. I remember, I remain optimistic, as is everybody in the panel, very optimistic. We have to work together. We have to work together. It's not going to be an easy task. Boaventura Sosa was saying that it's going to be very difficult. But there are different avenues ahead, as he said. There are three different avenues, and one of them points forward towards hope. And I would certainly hope that that is what we manage to do. And we can do this by upholding our commitment to do this. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We know how to do this. We understand these inherent contradictions in our societies, and we must do everything we can to strengthen democracy. Democracy to be understood in its most fundamental terms that would help us ennoble each and every member of the human race. The pandemic has given us a very clear picture of the contradictions we face and all of the things that must be overcome and changed in order to achieve sustainable development. This is something that calls for further strengthening democracy, and we cannot leave anyone behind. Now more than ever, we can afford to leave no one behind. And this is why it's essential for international cooperation to continue to flourish. UNESCO plays a key role here, but as Abel was saying, we should, as did other speakers, you talked about the importance of South-South cooperation. We have reached a level now where we in Latin America can exchange amongst ourselves, learn from one another in order to make progress. Uh, like a small human kingdom. Latin America, because of its cultural commonalities, linguistic commonalities, it can really make a difference and come up with sound responses to this crisis that has of unprecedented dramatic dimensions. But I think that the pandemic has given us a very clear picture of what's going on. Our message has been very clear here. We remain optimistic, and we do this because we realize that we all have to shoulder our responsibilities day in, day out, so that each of us can make our contribution to coming up with a solution. Alone, we can get nothing done, but working together, I'm certain that we can succeed. I hope that you all enjoyed the seminar. I would like to thank you, ADG Matoko, for helping us organize this dialogue. And despite the technical glitches, I think that we managed to achieve our stated goals. This is something that's part of a long-standing area of activity of UNESCO. UNESCO will stand by us as we go forward, making sure that member states can be successful in these fields. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Julio. Thank you for summarizing the discussion. I think what we can take away from this discussion is that this pandemic is universal. Somebody said it's been very democratic. Well, I would say actually it's just universal. It doesn't make any distinctions between people. There are no borders. And this is why it's imperative that we work together. This explains why we in UNESCO are always seeking to facilitate international cooperation on the basis of scientific evidence, a scientific understanding of the pandemic, and also to translate that into meaningful policy recommendations in the fields of education or social sciences. Many panelists spoke about a need for a paradigm shift in our model of development. And this is something that isn't specific to Latin America. We had a roundtable discussion with some African intellectuals recently, and they also mentioned that same need. We have to start thinking about international cooperation in order to invent a new future for mankind. Dear friends, distinguished permanent delegates to UNESCO who have joined us this afternoon and this evening, our guests, all of the young people who are watching on YouTube or Facebook, there shall be a video broadcast of this and then a video that will be uploaded so you can consult the discussion later. We would also like to thank our colleagues in the field offices of UNESCO in Santiago, in Costa Rica, Brazil, throughout the region. They've given their support to help organize this discussion. On behalf of the Director General, I would like to wish you all a pleasant afternoon or pleasant evening. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come in and join the conversation. You can count on UNESCO's firm commitment to continue working closely with your governments, with civil society in your countries, throughout the entire Latin American Caribbean region, as we try to develop long-term solutions. Long-term solutions to address crises such as these. So I would like to thank you all for your participation.
Your participation, and I would like also to say that there will be another opportunity for another meeting, which probably will be focusing on this idea of rethinking the future of the humanity, or rethinking the development. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches con todas y todos. Thank you very much. Merci.